Disposing fixed assets has come to be regarded as requiring a specialized skill set and dexterity, especially in an economy like Nigeria where instability in variables has over the years become the norm rather than the exception. Now, some of the requirements include proper documentation, legal and regulatory compliance, as well as valuation. How can all this be wielded to achieve maximum impact? Well, Francis Osifo is a highly accomplished entrepreneur, angel investor, mentor with a wealth of experience in building and scaling up startups. He now joins us to have a quick conversation. I want to say thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so talk to us. Disposing fixed assets. You see, there is a skill to it.
Yeah.
Explain to us.
Yeah, what you will find is like a lot of organizations have assets that they use for all of their operations, right? And a lot of organizations don't take cognizance or proper planning into, for these assets that we made this investment into, when the useful life is done and at the end of the day, how do we dispose of them, right? For larger corporations, what you'll find is that they have either third-party auditors or people internally within the business that help them in terms of consistently valuing the assets that are in the business and assessing the usefulness of those assets to the business. And when that is no longer valuable, there's a streamlined process to actually dispose those assets. If not, what you end up seeing is cases where people within the organizations connive to sell off the organization's assets at ridiculous prices in that case.
All right, Francis. Now, let's talk about the challenges regarding disposal of fixed assets and how can they be overcome, you think? And what is so unique about the Nigerian space in this regard?
I think a lot of the first big challenge, obviously, is the challenge of like valuation. How do you tell what the fair value of the asset is? Right? If you're able to clearly determine that, a lot of the time is to use like a third-party service or an auditor or a service provider that can come, and so that there's no bias, right, to actually identify the value of those assets in that case. I think the other is like compliance. For most organizations, depending on your industry, there is some regulation around the process for disposing of those assets. And the value of the assets sometimes might require like the board level approval for those assets to be disposed, so that it's not just people within organizations determining, oh, let's just sell off this item and get the money in that sense. I think to your point, within the Nigerian context will be a lot more around around like the process, right, and the thinking. And I think that what we have seen a lot more frequently is a lot of organizations are not very intentional around putting the process. So there's a lot of process around procurement. So how do we acquire? But there's not a lot of like thinking and intentionality around the processes that you put in place for handling those disposal when those assets get fully used. So take for instance like vehicles. Most companies have a depreciation policy that after 4 years, if the cars get sold off, it gets to be sold off in that sense. And you see large organizations put those kind of structures in place, but a lot of like younger companies don't have that existing. So it becomes a big problem at that end where organizations' assets get stolen. Even employees getting to the point where they intentionally damage those assets just so that they can get disposed in that sense. So, yeah.
All right. Okay. So talk to us. What are some of the important factors to consider when you are trying to value an asset for disposal? And how can businesses ensure they are getting accurate valuation? You just spoke about employees conniving to probably depreciate an asset so that they can easily get, so some of these assets can easily get disposed. But talk to us about accurate valuation.
I think, so to your point, like you said, is two things is around the valuation of the assets and the transparency of the disposal process, right? I think what I have seen working with a couple of companies today is where you find there is no transparency in the disposal process. So take for instance, I've seen a lot of organizations using like Google Form to dispose assets. So what it means is we are disposing a car and we set like the starting price, maybe because we've got an auditor to set the fair value price at, let's say 2 million. And you bid 2.1 million. But because it's a form that nobody knows what you've bid on that item, you end up seeing that he won it, but you could have probably bid maybe 2.5 million for that item. So what happens is one, the organization is able to get top value for that item. And two, people feel cheated in a way because I'm like, if I knew that was what was the most current bid, I would have been able to probably offer a lot more better for it in that sense. So for us is, how do you put a structure and help companies provide transparency around that process so that everybody can see, this is what the value that the next person has bidded on this item, and if I see that there's significant value, I probably want to offer more, and then that generates like a report that even you can provide to external auditors or even government or regulatory agencies in that sense as well.
Very good, Francis. I would like you to tell us about documentation when disposing of fixed assets and the need for accurate records and procedures. And also, in addition to that, you've been mentioning the issues of regulators. How proactive are they regarding these processes?
So I think in terms of like documentation, I think obviously it starts going back as well from the purchase process, right? I think a lot of people don't think about assets as having an entire life cycle, almost like a human, right? From the moment you buy the assets to the moment where the asset gets disposed, right? What happens with the documents around the purchase documents, the quotes, the receipts, the maintenance history of that asset?
Yeah.
How is that asset being depreciated? Are you tracking all of that? Are you documenting all of that? Because it makes it easy when you would then want to dispose, because there's like a history, there's historical records you're using for that context that it makes it easy at the point of disposal. I think in terms of like regulation is relatively difficult to regulate because in a way it's contextual based on the businesses. But what you will find is that businesses that play in regulated spaces have policies that are already defined, and so they follow that as well.
But how do you now ensure compliance?
So the compliance obviously is where is the interesting part, right? And so what you will find is most companies will set up like committees that will have maybe a blend between internal and external parties involved in that process. And like I mentioned, a lot of it is to kind of remove that bias, bringing in like third-party companies or auditors or services to bring that transparency and that compliance to say, okay, there is a proper check and there's a report that is presented that says this is the process that was followed in preparing the assets that were to be disposed, because who determines an item, what items should be disposed in the first place? Why are we disposing these items? Like, what is the recommendation that came out of that entire process before it goes into the entire disposal process in the first place?
All right, you mentioned Google Sheets, but let's talk about the role of technology and on automation, the roles that these play in the disposal of assets, and how can we leverage on these tools to streamline the process and reduce risk also?
Yes, so that is something that I am very excited about because, like you said, in today's age and time, one of the key work we've been doing over the years is building solutions that enable companies to streamline that disposal, right? So from how do you capture all of the assets that need to be disposed? And what you will also find is that companies are usually very quiet when they're disposing their assets, because there's also almost like a signal, a sense when people hear a company selling of assets, it almost implies as if the company is struggling. But sometimes that might not be the reason. It might be because they're disposing of those assets because they are those assets have reached end of life within their business. It could be because they've also they're cutting down on their headcount. So what you've seen over the last couple of months is even globally and locally, companies are gradually like reevaluating like their team size. That means that significant assets that were being used no longer are being needed anymore. And so the question then becomes, what do you do with those assets, right? And then it could also be cases where organizations move from one office to the other, right? And what we kind of try to help businesses with is the technology and the platform that enables them from capturing all of that clearly, ensuring that employees or vendors or whoever they want to be participating in that entire that disposal process can see that transparency in the process as well, and that all of the funds that is easily streamlined and collected back into the company's account, right, in that entire process. And there's a proper documented report that the organizations can provide to their own senior management and even to external auditors or parties where they are required to.
But do you think existing technology within the space of disposal of fixed assets is actually more proactive in terms of what we have now? Is it relevant to the business?
Yes, I think there are new solutions that are, like one of them is what we've worked on over the last couple of months or the years in that sense. I think there is also the awareness, a lot of education that also needs to happen, right? For people to start saying, okay, because a lot of it is that people do not, because they're not aware, so the people have devoted to like, very manual processes for doing it. And that, like I said, that breeds a lot of distrust around the entire process, right? But because if you provide them now with that solution, and we started seeing really great adoption in that sense, where you can say, hey, you have a platform and a product that allows you streamline the entire disposal process and ensure that the company gets fair value for the assets that they are disposing right into the company's account within a short period of time, then yes, the value becomes clear, and every party, both the company auctioning of the items and the individuals participating in the bidding process, feel comfortable because they know that, okay, I won this, or whoever won the item won it fair and square, and there was a transparency in the entire value chain.
Okay.
All right, talk to us. We'll probably address companies that are finding it difficult to dispose of some of their fixed assets? What would you advise them to do? How do you advise them to go about it?
I think, first of all, will be, I think my first recommendation will be, first of all, start thinking, don't think only at the point where you're thinking about disposing of your assets, start thinking right from the point you're acquiring those assets. So how do you put internally like policies and processes that enables you to track the history, because it makes it easy. But if that doesn't exist, at the point where you're thinking about disposing of those assets, explore working with like a third party to value those assets to ensure that there's proper documentation, because that chain of custody, when those assets are being transferred or being sold off, needs to be clearly defined, right? All of the ownership documents needs to then change hands in that sense. And then leverage technology. And that's one of the beautiful things that Radar has built over the couple of months to enable businesses now have the technology infrastructure to enable them streamline that disposal piece.
Very good, Francis. Now, let's talk about the best practices business should follow in fixed asset disposal. In 30 seconds, please.
So I think like some of the best practices we talk about is like documentation, documents cannot be overemphasized. Whatever process or whatever tool you end up using, ensure that there's transparency and provide documentation at the end of it as well. So there's documentation at the beginning, transparency in the middle, documentation at the end. So that would be like, yeah.
All right.
Very good.
Francis, Osifo, we want to say thank you very much for your time here on Newsday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.